My name is Zaleski. I am the Education Policy and Agency Relations Director for the Illinois Education Association. Where do you go to disseminate your work? My work is focused on education policy issues in the state of Illinois. Therefore, I work on publishing my research in Midwestern specific publications and publications oriented to the audience I'm trying to reach. In addition, I write research briefs and share them with appropriate advocacy organizations such as educator unions. Who might you contact to partner with so your work has the greatest visibility? Well, it depends on the topic of your work and the scope of your work. If the topic is related to education policy at the state or local level, then state educator unions, administrator organizations, and other state-specific advocacy groups are great partners. In addition, the state itself may be a good partner to share your research with. For example, opportunities for oral or written public comment at a state board or committee meeting or on proposed changes to administrative code allow you to share your work directly with policymakers. How might you get in contact with these entities, and what approach might you use to get your foot in the door? Do your research. For example, if you're interested in sharing your work with an educator union, consider the organization's leadership structure and the departments within the organization. Do they have a government relations department? If so, contacting the manager of that department might be a good place to start. Also, in Illinois, there's an Open Meetings Act that requires public notice of all state meetings. I often attend the public portions of Illinois State Board of Education meetings and sign up to make public comment when they're discussing a topic that is related to my work. I also attend additional state committee meetings and respond when the state makes a request for written public comment on proposed changes to administrative code. What considerations might you need to deal with when bringing your work to institutions and people outside of academia? I believe it's important to understand that policymakers are often dealing with multiple organizations and constituents that have opposing views on education policy topics. Position yourself as an expert resource that is there to help support the policymaker or organization in which you are trying to partner. What other thoughts might you have about working with not only with organizations, but with policymakers themselves? Policy change does not happen overnight. It can often take years. Educate yourself on your state's legislative process, committees, and policymakers. Attend state meetings as an observer to get to know which organizations are involved in advocating for the policies you're trying to influence. Accept that there will be legislators and organizations that will not agree with you. Policy change requires collaboration and compromise. What risks might there be to you as a scholar by going outside the academy, and what might you do to ensure your academic freedom? The primary risk you may encounter is finding yourself on opposing sides of a policy issue with your university or university system. Remember, in most states, there are state boards of higher education, and institutions of higher education, especially large ones, employ their own government relations and lobbying staff. If your work is related to higher education or may impact higher education, it's always best to begin your advocacy work within your own institution to garner their support. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Carly Champagne. I am an educational psychologist focused in early childhood. And starting in August of 2021, I spent a year in the U.S. Senate working on education, health, and housing policy. And I'm currently in the Department of Health and Human Services, specifically in the Administration for Children and Families in the Office of Child Care. So in terms of publishing work and connecting educational policy with educational psychology, and where I would disseminate that work, I would primarily consider listservs, so specifically related to my fellowship programs that I've been a part of, as well as professional societies and associations, and also potentially during public comment periods, specifically, for example, for regulations, for related federal policies, or even town halls at the more local level. In terms of who I would contact to partner with on my work to get the greatest visibility, I would definitely say in terms of advocacy organizations, folks like the Center for Law and Social Policy, or think tanks like the Learning Policy Institute. I would also definitely target policymakers directly, and specifically senators or representatives with a strong, recent record of legislation and or advocacy in the area. So, for example, Bob Casey, a senator for Pennsylvania, is pretty well known for advocacy and work in the special education space and supporting folks with disabilities. And then in terms of getting in contact with these folks and the approach to get your foot in the door, I would say email or phone, ideally through someone you already know, for sure. And I think being really as brief as possible. So definitely if you're speaking on the phone or in person, 5 minutes or less, ideally 2 minutes or less, to really get the initial kind of ask and thesis across of what you're asking for, but also, covering the why and the ask and the relevance to your audience, to the policymaker specifically, and having done the homework, right? So what maybe are some related policies to the one you're bringing to the table, and what are their bill numbers? Those are things that congressional staffers can really latch onto, look up quickly, sometimes right in the moment, and know right away if they are already in support of it, if they're working on supporting it, or if they don't think that's really going to be feasible. And then, of course, why it is important to this audience. So for policymakers in Congress, certainly, why does this relate to their constituents? Why is it important for their district or for their state? And then, in terms of working not only with organizations, but policymakers themselves and sort of tricks of the trade and dealing with folks in these decision-making roles, I definitely think it's important to keep in mind things like election cycles and where folks fall on that spectrum of progressive, liberal, moderate, conservative, and what it means for them to be an election cycle, because that can really dictate the amount of risk that they're willing to take, and also give you a sense of the timing of when things might be more amenable for them. In addition, as I mentioned, the relevance to constituents at the district or state level. Also understanding any current events that might be going on in that policy area, whether it's locally, at the state level, or nationally. So, for example, a lot of the anti-critical race theory rhetoric was national, but had a really specific impact in some states, for example, in the governor race in Virginia. So understanding those things, in these conversations and reach to policymakers, I think can really help give folks something to latch on to and get interested in, and really get them listening and showing to them too that you understand their world enough to understand what that connection is and why it should be meaningful and is important to them. So understanding also, I think, for the tricks of the trade and still talking about folks in those decision-making roles, understanding what the prominent current policies in that area are at the time, what current bills are out there already, and what's the push and pull in that particular space? What are the pros and cons that folks are talking about what are the talking points that are out there, and having those ready ahead of time, you can sort of nip that in the bud and have an understanding of where folks' lines of thinking are, where their positionality is going to be before you enter the conversation. And then again, cannot be stated enough to value their time and be very specific and very concise as much as possible. In terms of risks that there might be to you as a scholar going outside of the academy, in terms of jobs, certainly after leaving, re-entering academia can be difficult. But it's definitely possible if you can stay connected with academic colleagues, and for research or tenure track specific positions, certainly if you continue to publish. But in terms of, publishing outside of academia and risks to you as a scholar, I think actually it's really a benefit. And even though that may be more time spent on a publication that is not as valued by other folks, in the academic circles, that is really a really important exercise and skills I think you gain from putting that together. And so being really concise and targeted in your writing and presentation is something you might have, developed in classes and things like that a little bit, but not to the level that is expected and really demanded in policy and in politics. You just don't have time to dig in deep on one topic. And so I think those are really incredible skills to have when working with folks who need to make decisions quickly and without a ton of information. And so, yeah, while I do think it's, you may have that push and pull loss of time in terms of where you're devoting that writing time or publishing time, I think it's really valuable and important to have those skills developed and to reach those different audiences that are still going to find your work meaningful.